Welcome into an inaugural episode of Implicit Bias. And by inaugural, I don't mean it's our first episode. What I actually mean is it's a show after an inauguration. Our inaugural episode would actually be the first episode of this show, which you know isn't because we've been around for a number of years, which, by the way, also is not the first annual. No such thing. Rabbit hole we'll talk about later. I am your host, Kevon Bordelon. This is the first Implicit Bias Radio after the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States. And yes, we are still solving the problems of the world one or two or three weekly whiskeys at a time. We are still diving into the stories that you may or may not have heard about in the news. We are still having more fun than we should be allowed to have in the Mr. Lester's top secret podcast lair. That's the TSPL for the uninitiated. So it was very, very interesting during the inauguration that we actually got two full-on inaugural addresses. Not officially, but we might as well have. There was one in the actual rotunda that was pretty dignified. It was pretty straightforward and pretty much what you would expect in an inaugural address. Maybe, as some people have described it, a little more State of the Union than others. But the reality was, it wasn't far off from what you would expect from someone who is graced with the position of what many call the most powerful man in the world. Then we got the second one. The second one, well, if you're on that side of the aisle, it was a heck of a lot more fun. That's the one where we started to get all the dirt. That's the one where we started to maybe get the haze of professionalism removed. Maybe we got the veil of politeness lifted up and we got to actually see the true face of the bride. And what it dawned on us was this. Doesn't matter if your favorite politicians have a D or an R behind their name, or maybe even an I for independent. Doesn't matter if it's your best friend. Doesn't matter if it's your worst enemy. For some of us, it doesn't matter if it's the person that you live with consistently every single day. But the truth is this, is that what we get from people, especially politicians, when the cameras are rolling, much like you see right now, it's never who they actually are. And I don't mean never. I mean never who they actually are. Now, what do I mean by that? Every politician in the United States of America, in modern society, we pretty much know, well, they are giving us something that is prepared for television. It's a made-for-TV movie. That's all it is. We never get to see what's actually going on. I mean, think about the last 4 years. We've been told consistently, sharp as a tack, on point. And the reality is, not so much. That sucked. Can we throw an edit in there? Okay, perfect. So the reality is, not so much. The reality is, what we get is what all too often they want us to see, or sometimes what they can show us. Now, what do I mean by that? Think about it this way. For those Catholics out there who say rosaries, those Christians who know the story, the Transfiguration meant that not even Jesus could show everyone who and what he actually was. Only a very small, select group of people got to see that, and he actually swore them to secrecy. If you think the same thing doesn't happen in politics, but at a much greater level, and also at potentially a much more evil level, well, we're probably all very sadly mistaken. So yes, this is an inaugural edition of Implicit Bias. We have gotten to see maybe what's behind the curtain just a bit, because we did get not one, but two addresses. The key is, know what you're dealing with. And for those of us who much rather the devil that we know as opposed to the devil that comes to us with a nice smiling face, well, that's maybe the big takeaway. See, politicians, especially in the US, have done their best for decades to make sure that what they did show you was palatable, maybe even likable. After all, the devil's not going to show up and tell you, I'm the devil, I'm here to steal your soul. The devil's going to show up and say, I'm nice, I'm polite, I'm likable. And then, when you're not looking, he's going to pardon more people than every other president in history combined. When you're not looking, he's going to make sure that he pardons every member of his family. Those devils, those are the ones you got to worry about the most. And those devils live on both sides of the aisle. Because if it's pardons or handouts or pork barrel projects, it's all the same. They're all trying to show you what they think you want, as opposed to the one thing that we look for consistently here on Implicit Bias, and it's the truth. Which brings us back to that old premise that we talk about often on this show, but sometimes we don't say it enough. And that premise is this: believe none of what they say. Believe only what they do. So we've got a track record over what was done in the last 4 years. We've got a track record as to what was done 4 years before that. And now we're going to have to see if that aligns with what's about to happen in the 4 years headed our way. And that might be, hopefully, what's aligned with your implicit bias. Now, we are going to continue to solve the problems of the world one weekly whiskey at a time. This week, well, if it's an inaugural episode of Implicit Bias, it's only fitting that we have the presidential dram as part of our weekly whiskey. It's only fitting that we sample maybe more than one. Maybe we'll see if the crew in the TSPL can sample 47 of them. I doubt that happens. But you never know with some of the people sitting at the bar. And there's the bell, which tells me that it's time to go. Not for the show, but it's time to bring in the rest of the crew. It's time to sample our weekly whiskey to let you know what we think. And it's time for us to get you ready for 2 hours of Implicit Bias Radio.